Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Oh, a book is like a genie in a bottle. And what a wonderful bracing moment when you open it.
Hello and welcome to Tsundoku. I'm Sarah Martin.
And I'm Cath Keneally.
If you're a book addict, don't go anywhere. You found your tribe.
We hope Tsundoku gives you a bit of inspiration to whittle away at that pile of books that are awaiting your attention, or maybe simply a reason to add something new.
On that, what are you reading right now, Cath?
Okay, before I left home this morning, I was rereading 450 from Paddington, an Agatha Christie comfort read. I think that's her best. I was needing a little bit of relief because I had just put down a really great new Australian novel that I found quite by accident by someone called Jessica Stanley, called A Great Hope.
What's the premise of that one?
The Great Hope is a trade union leader who wasn't persuaded to stand as an MP at the Rudd election. He's a fictional character, but all of the political scenario is factual. It's all about his family, a very dysfunctional family, and what they're up to. It's a terrific psychological analysis of the era and of the people. It's really cleverly done. This is her first novel, and I'm going to be very interested in what she does next.
That sounds fascinating. There's been a theme of this style of writing lately. Like the one Rodham, for example, comes to mind, where it's based in around fact and political reality, but their characters are completely fictionalised.
I think it's very audacious. It really works well. It's terrific.
And so then you needed a comfort read, though. So that's bodes well for knowing how we go after that.
I found somebody's collection of Agathas at my local Salvos, and they're the lovely old Fontana ones with brilliant covers. I just swooped the lot for $1 each.
Just perfect.
Here I go again.
But you've also been digging into somewhat of a classic.
So Dr. Lisa Bennett and I discovered that we were both big fans of a groundbreaking early 70s fantasy writer. Have a listen to this.
Lean as a hound he was and huge as a hill. Ged stared in awe. There was no song or tale could prepare the mind for this sight. Almost he stared into the dragon's eyes and was caught, for one cannot look into a dragon's eyes. He glanced away from the oily green gaze that watched him.
So you might have recognised that, if you're also a fan, as a bit of Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea trilogy. We'll be chewing that over later in the program.
I look forward to listening to that, Cath. But first, I'd like to bring you a conversation I had with Scott McCulloch about his debut novel, Basin. It's a bleak and unsettling book that's set in an unnamed hallucinatory war zone, which draws on Scott's travel in Abkhazia and Crimea and the Donbass. I won't say it was easy reading, but it was really very interesting.
I wouldn't say that it's autobiographical, but of course there are things that are driven by direct encounters and things that I've bared witness to and so forth. The sense of motion and the sense of moving around where I've been living in the last few years, mainly Eastern Europe and the Middle East.
What took you there? Why do you base yourself in Eastern Europe?
Just some natural affinity with it, but particularly with literature and all of the cinema that comes out of that part of the world, but also ancestrally as well. My mother's Ukrainian, so from that side of the family, there was that lineage and so forth, but just more of a personal yearning, I guess.
It's been a pretty amazing and abrupt part of the world to be living in this last year. What's that experience been like for you?
I haven't been in Ukraine for quite some time, since before the pandemic, because it was difficult to get there. And when the war broke out, I haven't been back there since, but I've been in Georgia, mainly in Tbilisi. And Georgia has endured a similar relationship with Putin's Russia. So you can feel it on the street. It's very tense.
Where and how do you make time to write?
I usually have to isolate myself. I go into a bit of hermit mode, usually head out into the villages and just go a bit cuckoo in the coconut until I can not write anymore. But I was really lucky. I got a couple of grants, so that afforded me the privilege to write full time.
That's a game changer, isn't it? Particularly because the world you've realised is so absorbing. You kind of need to sink yourself right into it, I'd imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And also when it comes down to that, with the field research and the realisation of the book, I was fortunate enough to be able to do it in situ, because it's a surreal road narrative. And yeah, the places are abstracted and it's not particularly clear where the place is within any given moment throughout the text. The places where it is loosely based on, I managed to follow that road myself.
It's a grim world that you're experiencing. How would you best describe that time and place?
I'm not sure, but at the same time, I understand that it's bleak and that it has a sense of relentlessness to it. But at the same time, to me, it's also kind of a celebration or an affirmation of life, because this person has come to and chosen to survive and is just running on the sheer libido of moving from place to place.
It certainly took me into that space, like I was travelling with your protagonist throughout and in their head. And that doesn't always happen with books. Quite often you'll stop and you take more time, I guess, and you're on the outside of that action, whereas this very much took you inside for the whole experience. And that's very compelling as a reader. How intentional was it to make sure that it was very much in Figure's head?
I always kind of knew that it was going to be first person present tense, because I just wanted to have that rollicking immediacy. And I also understood that because of a lot of the reference material that it was based on, pieces of Pierre Guillotin, writers like Clarice Lispector, even Faulkner to a degree, or some more ancient texts, the way in which that psychological dimension had to come through was using the first person. I knew that textually there was going to be an abrasiveness. And so to try and offer some arm of absorption, then try to have that form of directness. And living up to the complexities, the realities of what it's talking about, the themes and the questions that it's talking about, which have a sense of urgency themselves. So try to replicate that as a reading experience.
The characters that Figure comes across are very brash, but in a world of harshness, there's this, it's hard to say kindness, but it's like comradeship, I guess. What did you use to place those experiences? Are they based on observations and research on how people act in those kind of circumstances?
Partly, yeah. And a lot of it is just as it appears throughout the book. It's very happenstance. It's quite spontaneous and so forth. Aslan, for example, the main character in the first act of the novel, is essentially a composite of several characters who I met who had been in that kind of situation before. They were veterans, or they were within various battalions, especially in the 90s during the civil wars and the breakup of the Soviet Union and the fallout of the Soviet Union. And so it was kind of a potpourri of different people who I've met, but it's also abstracted and fictionalized at the same time.
The landscape, obviously, you've based it on the places that you've travelled through. Mm-hmm. The connection to water throughout it all is really powerful, and my vision of it was sort of set in this swampy world that just didn't let up. It's quite a phenomenal space that could be anywhere, but also feels very specific. Where is your inspiration for that from?
Well, that's a secret, Sarah. We can say that it's the northeast horn of a body of water, of a sea that is in the general direction of the Eastern Bloc. It's the Black Sea, yeah. And the territories, Crimea, Abkhazia, also then on the Azov Sea, parts of the bottom of the Donetsk Basin, Mariupol, etc., which is, obviously having a really terrible time right now. Yeah, and those general waters.
Yeah, I found it very confronting reading it with an awareness of what's going on in that part of the world as well. I know it's fictionalized, but it was very easy to see how close to the bone it could potentially be for people living in those spaces right now, which is sadly timely.
And the book was finished at least 2 years ago. It's been sitting in the drawer for a while. Yeah, now it's a bit too real.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
How does that feel from your perspective?
Yeah, it's difficult and it's hard, obviously, but so far, at least what I've been able to pick up is that the book hasn't been completely interpreted or filtered through that perspective, which I'm grateful for. But like you say, obviously there are parallels and inroads, connections. I'm a bit at a loss for words because, it is it's really intense.
It really explained displacement that would be experienced from people who are trying to find a space in new lands and amongst new peoples and just trying to find their feet. Did you do research specific to the refugee experience to kind of inform that at all?
To some extent, yeah, but mainly theoretical research, reading up on history texts and so forth and moving through it in that sense. But yeah, also a lot of interviewing. For example, if we're talking about Ukraine specifically, I was at the end of the Euromaidan revolution when they were closing down the square and kicking everybody out who'd been occupying the place. So yeah, it's a combination of on the ground, direct interviews, conversations, hanging out with people / reading.
How hard is it to separate yourself when your research is sort of experience-based?
I don't think there is much separation. It's just a sense of giving over and just trying to be as involved as possible without any of the dubiousness.
It's your first novel, but you've done lots of writing before.
Mm-hmm.
What was the difference in that experience between your previous writing and then trying to realise this kind of body of work?
It was a big step because moving into long form narrative, that was really difficult for me. Beforehand, I've had an abandoned manuscript, of course, as probably is the case for a lot of novelists or budding novelists. The thing is I was doing some reportage and I was doing more, I guess, non-fiction based works. But also alongside that, I was always writing fiction, always writing prose. And coming off the back of that experience, I failed to write a novel before because I was too young and silly. Then I realized that I tried to make this kind of triptych, I guess, so 3 pieces of fiction to paint the matrix of what became long form, and just a lot more research, putting a lot more effort into where are the arcs, where are the ebbs and flows. I was really lucky too because I had a series of confidants that helped me with that. And then the immensity of, again, coming back to interviewing people and all these encounters that it fictionalized, but it's based on, that just kept making the word count go up.
Was it a different type of discipline in approaching the long form?
The manuscript, at least the original iteration of it, it probably happens in 3 intensive writing blocks where I would write on the road in the places where it was set for minimum 2, sometimes 3 months at a time. But after 3 months, I would end up burning out, and also like going a bit too monastic with it. I would take vows of silence and things like this and be on a particular diet. It was a form of madness to some degree, but it's just kind of what it was, the necessary rhythm to get in that kind of mindset.
Reading it, I can see how you have to really, sink into that moment to do it. How did it feel coming back up to light outside of those intensive moments?
Well, I remember after one of those hermit hibernation solitary periods, my partner at the time came and saw me and she was like, whoa, okay, let's go eat something. But like I said, it's just the necessary way to do it. That's what felt right at the time. But then also, that altered again once the editing process came along, when I met Chris Fike and Julia and Lauren from Black Ink, who are wonderful, wonderful editors. That was another rhythm too. That was also intensive bouts. I think, we went through a stage of fairly standard structural copy editing and proofreading. So in 3 stages, but they would be in these kind of intensive 2-week blocks with gaps between, which imitated the writing process as well.
The voices in Basin are primarily from the male gaze.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, that's the thing I found the most challenging, was it was very much set from that perspective. What would you, I guess, say to female readers to place themselves in a mindset to read Basin? Because, as I say, I found it at times quite jolting.
Yeah. Well, obviously it's a very patriarchal and chauvinistic and misogynistic world. I just felt that if there's anything that's coming through as non-fiction through the text, like I had to speak to that to some degree. And to obfuscate that and not let that shine through, then it would become a matter of representation, which would distract from the narrative of the text and the characters and so forth. And it's also, you're dealing with an unreliable narrator who is possibly part of this world, and it possibly has, many politics and personal thoughts that I myself completely disagree with. But hopefully that comes through as a visceral reading experience. And yeah, I understand that it's jolting and that it has its difficulties, but it also is obviously trying to have this leveling and this flattening of morality through the text. The book is not concerned with morality very much. In these kind of situations, morality goes out the window.
It made sense in terms of the context. It's just, I guess, and it was just like, all right, whoa, here we are.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like you're right, to have softened it in any way wouldn't have represented your characters or the situation truly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad that comes
right
through. And it's also, there's a lot to be said for absence as well. That's something Julie and I talked about early on. It's like, are all the female characters just sex workers and mothers? It's like, well, on the surface, yes, but it's also, you're really dealing with the hallucinations of this quite tweaked individual.
And that's the challenge as well. It's all delusional. There's like a dementia, a drug-addled narrative that's throughout the whole thing. So sometimes as the reader, you're trying to find your feet, trying to place yourself somewhere, but you don't know where you're standing. It certainly is 100% committed to the distortion of reality that sits through it all.
Yeah, and it's obviously the narrator is unnamed all the way throughout, and there's a sense of ambiguity to him, and is this cipher or this conduit of this world that is absorbing and so forth. So I had to give him as much personality as I could.
Some of the drugs and some of those things that appear must be quite fascinating to kind of think of something that's so bizarre that you can place in the hands of this person and see how they use it. That's freeing, isn't it, as a writer?
I suppose. And yes, and some of the more crazier stuff that is in the book, that's more autobiographical. It's like the unbelievable things are kind of the things that are based on real experiences rather than the more believable sides. There are those scenes where the men are sitting around on the ship drinking different moonshines that have some kind of animistic, ritualized, shamanic connection with animals, where they have, body parts of animals within the spirit itself. That's something that I experienced in Timor-Leste years ago when I was working there about 10 years back. And so it's based on that. Yeah, there were deer embryos and crocodile penises in this locally brewed shine. And so that reared its head back.
I think that's part of what's interesting in the experience is that blurring, because when you travel through different countries and you see what traditional mythologies underlie things and those kind of weird and wild creations based on shamanistic principles or other things like that in terms of medicines and stuff, there's enough that cuts close to the line where you're like, okay, that could be a real place and a real thing. And so it's fun to play with that blurring because it just makes it more and more sharp in terms of your narrator's validity and the reader's experience, I guess.
That reminds me of the scene toward the end of the second act, the minstrel scene where they're at that dinner party at Costa's place in the middle of the steppe. That's based on this element of Circassian folklore, Circassian, being two particular areas in the North Caucasus where I was traveling through when I was writing. And yeah, again, it's grandiose and it's a little bit fictionalized, but there would be these banquets and these parties where the host would hire such a minstrel to essentially go around the room, go around the table and make fun of everybody. And it's been happening for centuries, yeah.
You mentioned before you've got a grant for something more. What's your next plans?
As I'm sure you can tell, Sarah, there's a lot of themes and questions that are left unanswered throughout Basin. I'm trying to figure out if I can extrapolate that to another body of water. It would be something similar, not a sequel necessarily, but it's part of what looks like an interlocking cycle of fictions set on different bodies of water around the world that have experienced some sense of ethnic conflict or sectarianism on their coastlines. And so that's taken me to the Eastern Mediterranean, mainly to Lebanon, where I've been living on and off since just after the explosion in 2020.
There's so much material out there for exploring these themes. Basin, I just felt dense. There wasn't a wasted word. Everything's just very, very much like shotgun sort of realization, observation, and every single statement to me felt like it could be pulled out and explored. I think there's so much opportunity to take these themes and find them in other settings and in other experience, historically and even in present, which is sad, but also worth interrogating, I feel.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the reality of what's happening. And so these cosmic urgencies that come to the fore, I never expected to answer anything, but we've got a long way to go.
There I was speaking with Scott McCulloch. He's the author of Basin, and as you could hear, he's seen and heard a lot, and he trudges you through quite a distinct experience, which, like I said up front, is not altogether comfortable, but it's pretty compelling reading.
Good work, Sarah. It sounds like you might need a little dose of Agatha Christie yourself now.
I think I might go scour my local salvos.
So as I mentioned earlier, I've been reacquainting myself with the work of Ursula Le Guin, who has left our company fairly recently, and a lot of people have been talking about what a groundbreaking fantasy writer she was. I enjoyed the opportunity of sitting down with Dr. Lisa Bennett to discuss how she affected us back in the day and what we think of her now. We're talking about Ursula Le Guin. We've sadly just lost her to the planet, haven't we? She might be out there in the ether or in one or other of these lands.
Possibly.
Right now. But I first came across the Earthsea trilogy in the mid-70s, and the books were very recent. At the time, I thought I've never read anything quite like this before. And now I've come back to them. It doesn't seem as groundbreaking now as it did then in terms of the concepts. It was the language that ran away with me this time, the absolutely beautiful, rolling language that seems somehow modelled a little bit on maybe it was Middle English stories, or I don't know, but she's channeling something beautiful with the language.
It's something that reading it, because like you, I read it years ago, and honestly I can't even remember when it was. I just remember images, and I remember the islands described and things like that. I remember not knowing how to pronounce Ged's name, and it wasn't until hearing it spoken on an audiobook that I went, oh, okay, it's Ged, not Jed.
Not Jed,
gotcha.
yes.
But I don't remember reading it the first time except for in a flash of magical images and being in a world that I wanted to explore. And so coming back to it this time, I did notice the language like you, and I also thought about the style is a lot more, I don't want to say quaint because that's belittling, but it's a more old-fashioned tone than what a YA book would be nowadays. And along the same lines, it's written in a really told voice. This is a told story rather than a story where we are immersed into Ged's perspective and feel his trials and tribulations as he's going through them. Instead, we're always in that omniscient perspective. So in a sense, that puts us in a position to look at the language, to see how long her sentences are, her long paragraphs, all the things that I love luxuriating in that language. But it's something that is so strikingly different from how YA novels are marketed and written today that it really feels like we're stepping into a different era when we read it, as well as into another world, obviously. And I found that wonderful and also confronting, because I've now become trained to get into a character's head and really immerse myself in their viewpoint. And so for this to constantly be watching Ged go through his trials and tribulations, even when they were tough, I kind of felt a bit removed from what he was going through. And I also must admit, and I don't want people to at me about this, but I was also a bit removed from the fact that it was another story about a dude going on a quest. And I went, wow, I don't remember thinking that the first time I read it.
That is what I could not get past.
Me neither. Oh, I'm so glad to hear that.
This time I thought, feminism has intervened in the period since I read this. It's all about the boys. And the wizards are the only ones with the overarching power. there are quite a few disrespectful remarks passed about witches and sorceresses and wise women who have powers but lesser powers.
And they're not allowed to go to the Wizard's
They're
Isle
not
and
allowed.
learn.
No, and it's so blokey. And Le Guin herself, of course, became a strong feminist and known as her adult fiction, and her science speculative fiction in later life, and certainly looking back, I'm sure she would have. I kept thinking, if you were writing it again now, it would be different.
It's true, and it's funny you say that, because in preparation for this, I did a little bit of reading, because I remember Ursula Le Guin as the feminist. So rereading the first book, I thought, who wrote this book? This isn't the Ursula Le Guin that I know and whose essays I've read and whose lectures I've either read or watched. And so I did read a lecture that was published in with the collection that I've got. And she presented it in the 90s. And she was essentially looking back at the Earthsea trilogy and saying that she now is a different writer than the person who wrote those books. And that what happened when she was writing those books was that she was trying to write with a man's voice, and also was kind of immersed in the world in which she lived and hadn't really realized that there could be another option. So she did take some risks by having her characters be people of color, which none of the covers showed. So she was breaking boundaries that way, but within a super conventional, masculine,
context.
The hero's journey with the boy going off on
Yes.
so the whole thing. And so in this lecture, she was saying that was something, it wasn't that she said she was ashamed of it, but that this is something that she wouldn't write again. And so that's why the fourth book becomes a lot more centered on women and shifts focus and actually allows women to have a voice and power, and not just do all the expected sort of things.
That's right. And the fourth book is much more of an adult book. It reads more like an adult book. Of course, she does move from Wizard of Earthsea to the Tombs of Atuan, and there we're focusing on a young girl who's being trained to be a priestess. But again, she has no power.
None at all. She's thrust into this situation. She's taken away from her family, put into this role, and then
serving the nameless ones.
And at the end, it's still about the man anyways.
She's rescued by Ged.
I know. It's so dissatisfying.
I'm so pleased you've responded exactly the same way.
Me too, because I worried that we would come here and he'd say, I have these wonderful memories. I read so many articles from authors I admire, like Margaret Atwood, talking about how wonderful Le Guin's Earthsea trilogy is and how important it is. And it was important. And I think books like Harry Potter would not exist if it wasn't for this book.
I kept thinking, Harry Potter, how can we keep Harry Potter out of our brains as we're rereading these?
But at the same time, even while I was reading all these famous authors saying how much they loved these books and how moved they were by them, that I thought, I'm a traitor because I don't love them now the way that I did when I was a kid.
I have to say I agree with you. And I kept thinking, okay, I'll stop focusing on what's not in the books, and I'll try and just be carried away by the language. And after rereading Wizard of Earthsea really carefully, I thought, she is one of the best writers I've ever read about the sea.
Yes.
So fabulous, the sea and sea personship and
yes, and that's it. I mean, Ged is in a ship for quite a lot of this book.
Of the book,
and that could be really boring. Chasing the shadow that is obviously a part of himself that he has summoned up.
Very Jungian, isn't it?
Very Jungian, and so but really just being in a little boat, being powered by magic, chasing it across waves endlessly could be very dull, but her description of landscape, of places, of the magic systems, it's also wonderful, but there is that overarching element of just the
and
story
possibly
itself.
The best described dragon
I've
ever read about.
When Ged goes to that island and the dragon is so formidable That's the way dragons should be.
Exactly so. What's the difference with Te Hanu? What happens there? Can you sum it up for us?
I must admit that I have not made it to Te Hanu.
I've only speed read through this
So
one. But
I read Ursula Le Guin talking about the process of writing this book, and she said it actually took her 17 years to get that book right.
There you go.
I think she felt so dejected after realizing that she had written the trilogy from trying to write with a man's voice, and it wasn't her authentic voice. And so she was trying to find a way back into that world to right those wrongs as she saw them.
Yeah.
And so it took her a really long time to finally break down the writer's block around this book. So 17 years until finally she wrote it. And as you said, it's much more directed towards an young adult audience rather than the original Earthsea books, which could have been read by much younger people.
And we do have a female power in this one.
Definitely.
So, Lisa, do you think, I kept thinking, well, who would I give this to among my young colleagues who would read it?
This is a really good question. As I was rereading the first book, I kept thinking, who would read this book? Who would stick with it?
Me too.
And it's tough because it is beautiful. And I feel like young adult readers want to have the immersion in the protagonist's perspective much more than what you're going to get with this book. So I feel like you would share it with a fan of fantasy, someone who reads a lot, who is a voracious reader and who is willing to stick with a book even if it's a bit tough. Because I feel like this is written in a voice that most adults nowadays would possibly engage with, but maybe a 12-year-old would find challenging. What Ursula Le Guin does best is that kind of philosophical thinking, where she teases out a thought for a really long paragraph instead of simply saying, and now he's going to fight the dragon, So you have to have a reader that's really willing to engage with that kind of
You need a
thought.
kid who's into metaphysics.
Yeah, a kid who's a thinker, who is somebody that doesn't need all the whiz-bang kind of fantasy tropes happening.
Yeah.
There's magic, there are dragons, it's a wizarding school, it's the whole shebang. But if you expect it to be pacey like Harry Potter, that's not what you're going to get with this book.
And if that doesn't lead you into the work of Ursula Le Guin, nothing will. That was Dr. Lisa Bennett talking to me about the Earthsea trilogy in particular.
I've never read it, and I'm really inspired now to give it a go.
Yeah, you won't be sorry.
This is Tsundoku for people who would happily sign up for a holiday in a library.
My name is Chelsea Lewis and I'm 46. I had a very good upbringing in terms of lots of books around, lots of reading when we were children, lots of books read to us. Lived with someone for almost 20 years and probably our library was like the centrepiece of our home. I don't read as much as I would like to. I've got lots of books that are half read. Yes, I'm an Aries. I'm a good starter, not a good finisher. Packing up to evacuate from a bushfire in the Adelaide Hills. When you have to make that decision about what you're going to take with you, one of the things that I packed on the 2 occasions that we had to evacuate was Fish Out of Water, which was my favourite picture book when I was a little kid. So yeah, that's definitely a very special one. I think the reason that I liked that book so much is probably the memories of reading it, with my parents, and the thrill of the fish getting bigger and being put in the bath and all that. Like, just I guess the ride of the story. Yeah. A lot of the books that I am drawn to are non-fiction. A lot of political books. So I've got Julia Gillard, I've got Hillary Rodham Clinton, got Clementine Ford's books, those sorts of things. But also I'm very drawn to Australian authors and Australian stories. The Yield by Tara June Winch and Talking to My Country by Stan Grant. The wisdom and the knowledge that could be shared with non-Indigenous Australians or people all over the world, but particularly non-Indigenous Australians. I think that they're 2 pretty powerful books.
If you're keen to share your reading habits and reading past and a glimpse at your Tsundoku, we'd love to hear from you too. Send us a voice memo to tsundokukast@gmail.com. Thanks for joining us. I'm Cath Keneally.
And I'm Sarah Martin. Catch you next time.
This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts refusing treatment.
Sarah Martin,
Annie Hastwell,
Michaela Andreev,
and me, Cath Keneally. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. If you want to find out more about the books and authors featured in this program, check out the show notes. And you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Tsundoku Cast, which is TSUNDOKU Cast.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.